The message came in the middle of the night, on every human channel at once. It did not ask. It ordered. The Varathi Concord, a union of 12 alien species that ruled most of the known stars, wanted a human representative to appear before their council. They wanted answers about a battle that had just destroyed one of their fleets. Earth sent one person. Her name was Elena Voss. She was not a soldier. She was not armed. She did not bring guards or ships full of weapons. She came alone, in a small unarmed shuttle, and she asked for nothing special when she arrived, except a chair to sit in. The council chamber was built high above a colony world that had recently seen fighting. It was a huge room, shaped like a circle, with high glass walls that showed the stars outside. Around the circle sat the leaders of the 12 Concord species. Some had scales. Some had 4 eyes. Some breathed gases that would kill a human in seconds, and so they sat behind glass domes filled with their own air. All of them stared down at the small human woman who had just walked into their chamber. They expected fear. They expected excuses. Humanity was new to the galaxy, small in numbers, weak in ships compared to the Concord's mighty fleets. Every species in that room had heard the same story about humans: young, angry, but ultimately harmless. A species that could be managed with the right pressure. Voss did not look afraid. She looked calm, almost bored, as she took her seat at the small table set aside for her in the center of the circle. She folded her hands and waited. The first speaker of the council, a tall being named Kalrash Dune, rose to address her. His race was proud, ancient, and used to being obeyed. His voice echoed through the chamber. "Human," he said. "3 days ago, one of our fleets entered a system near your border. 40 ships, trained crews, a fleet meant to enforce order on a colony that refused to honor a resource agreement. Within minutes, every ship in that fleet was destroyed. No warning was given, no demand was made, no mercy was shown. We call this murder. We call this a violation of the laws of war that every civilized species in this galaxy follows. We want an explanation. We want an apology. And we want to know why humanity thinks it can act like this without consequence." Voss let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke. "I'll need to see your evidence first," she said simply. "Show me the fleet's own records. Show me their orders." Kalrash frowned, clearly expecting a different response. Anger, denial, fear, something he could push against. Instead, he nodded to a technician, and a large screen lit up above the circle, showing recorded footage from the doomed fleet's own cameras. The recordings showed the Concord ships approaching a small human mining colony on the edge of a border system. The colony was unarmed, home to a few thousand workers and their families. The fleet moved into position around it, weapons charging. Then, without warning, the space around the fleet seemed to come alive. Dark shapes, barely visible even on sensors, moved between the ships. There were no explosions of light, no dramatic battle. Ship after ship simply went dark, disabled or destroyed within seconds, as if some silent hand had reached out and closed a fist around each one in turn. In less than 3 minutes, the entire fleet of 40 ships was gone. No message had been sent. No warning had been given. It was, by any measure the Concord understood, an execution. The council watched Voss carefully as the recording played, looking for a reaction. She watched without any visible emotion, her eyes following the screen closely, as if she were studying something familiar rather than something shocking. When the recording ended, Kalrash spoke again, his voice harder now. "You see it as clearly as we do, an unprovoked slaughter. Humanity has broken every rule of engagement recognized by every species in this hall. We have fought wars among ourselves for 1,000 years, and even in our worst conflicts, we give warning before we strike. We announce our intentions. We allow surrender. This," he gestured at the screen, "this is nothing but cold-blooded murder." Voss finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to reach every corner of the chamber. "Before I respond to that, I want to ask you something. Do any of you know what orders that fleet was carrying when it entered our system?" The chamber went quiet. Several counselors exchanged glances. Kalrash's confidence seemed to waver, just slightly, though he tried to hide it. "The fleet was there to enforce the resource agreement," he said. "Nothing more." "That's not what its own orders say," Voss replied. "We intercepted them 3 days before the fleet even left Concord space. Would you like to hear what they actually said?" No one answered. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Voss continued anyway. Your fleet wasn't sent to negotiate, or to enforce a treaty through normal means. It was sent to pacify the colony. That word, in every language spoken in this chamber, has one meaning when used in a military order. Remove all resistance, by any means necessary, including the killing of civilians who refuse to comply. Your own commanders wrote that order. Your own government approved it. And you sent it toward thousands of unarmed miners and their families. A murmur ran through the council. Several of the alien leaders turned to look at Kalrash, whose composure had begun to crack. That is a translation error, he said quickly. A misunderstanding of context. It isn't, Voss said. We checked it 7 times, using 7 different translation systems, including 2 built by your own scientists, that we obtained through public trade channels. The order was clear. Your fleet was on its way to commit what your own laws, if applied honestly, would call a war crime. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Some counselors looked at each other in confusion, as if hearing this news for the first time. Others looked away, unable to meet the human woman's eyes. It became clear, in that moment, that not everyone on the council had known the true nature of the fleet's mission. Whatever had happened, some among them had been kept in the dark, used as a united front for a decision made by only a few. Kalrash tried to recover his authority. Even if the orders were as you describe, that does not excuse what was done to our fleet. There was no warning, no chance to explain, no chance to withdraw. You simply destroyed them. Voss tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone might study an old photograph, searching for details they had missed before. You keep saying you, she said, as if I ordered that attack, as if any human ordered that attack. I want to be very clear about something, Counselor Kalrash, because I think it will matter a great deal to everyone in this room before we're finished today. She paused, letting her words settle. No human gave the order to destroy your fleet. No human even knew it was happening, until after it was already over. The chamber erupted into noise, voices overlapping in disbelief and confusion in a dozen different languages. Kalrash raised a hand, demanding silence, though it took several long seconds before the room obeyed. That is impossible, he said. 40 warships were destroyed with perfect coordination. That does not happen by accident. That does not happen without command. I didn't say it happened without command, Voss said calmly. I said it happened without a human giving that command. There's a difference, and I think you're about to learn why that difference matters more than anything else in this room. She reached into the small bag she had carried with her, the only thing she'd brought into the chamber, and placed a single data drive on the table in front of her. Before I explain further, she said, I want you to understand something about my species. You've studied us for years. You've watched our wars, our arguments, our slow and clumsy growth into the stars. You've concluded, correctly, that we are new here, and that we are, in many ways, still finding our place among older and more powerful civilizations. What you have not understood, what almost no one outside our own worlds understands, is why we are the way we are. And I think, by the time I finish telling you, some of you will wish you had asked that question a long time before you sent 40 ships to attack a mining colony. The council chamber, filled with beings who had ruled the stars for centuries, before humanity had even left its own solar system, sat in uneasy silence, waiting for a small, calm woman to explain exactly what they had done. Voss stood from her chair, something she had not done since arriving, and walked a slow circle in the open space at the center of the chamber. Every eye in the room followed her. Humanity's history is short compared to yours, she began. A few 100,000 years of existence on one small world, and only a few centuries of real technological growth. In that time, we fought each other constantly. Tribes against tribes. Nations against nations. We invented weapons that could destroy entire cities, and more than once, we used them. We came closer to destroying ourselves completely than any of you have ever come to destroying yourselves, as far as our own historians can tell from studying your records. Several counselors shifted uncomfortably. The Concord species were proud of their long, mostly peaceful history of managing conflict through careful diplomacy and controlled, declared warfare. They saw themselves as far more advanced than the chaotic, violent history of humanity. During our worst century, Voss continued, a period we call the Long Silence, entire nations disappeared, Not through war exactly, through the slow, quiet policy of letting weaker groups be starved, displaced, or killed, while stronger nations debated whether to act. Millions died while committees met and argued about proper procedure, about whether intervention would violate someone's sovereignty, about whether the evidence was strong enough to justify action. By the time anyone agreed to do something, there was often nothing left to save. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. After that period ended, humanity made a decision. Not a law exactly, though it became law eventually in every human nation. A principle. We decided that we would never again wait for proof beyond all doubt while people were being murdered. We decided that once genocidal intent was clearly established, not suspected, not rumored, but established through solid evidence, action would be immediate, and it would not wait for negotiation, because negotiation, in our experience, is what monsters use to buy themselves time to finish the job. Kalrash's expression had shifted from anger to something more careful, more wary. You are describing your own history, he said, not an excuse for what happened to our fleet. I'm getting to that, Voss said. You asked why your fleet was destroyed without warning. The answer is that warnings, in cases like this, don't save lives. They cost them. Every hour spent delivering an ultimatum, waiting for a response, allowing for negotiation, is an hour a determined killer can use to finish what they started. Humanity learned this lesson through the deaths of people we could have saved, if only someone had acted sooner instead of following proper procedure. So you claim the right to act as judge, executioner, and army, all without a single word of warning, another counselor said, her voice sharp with disbelief. That is not justice. That is simply violence, dressed up as principle. I understand why it looks that way to you, Voss said, and for the first time, something like real weight entered her voice. Your societies built their laws of war around the assumption that everyone follows similar rules, that even your enemies value the appearance of honor, the formality of declared conflict, the theater of diplomacy before violence. Humanity does not share that assumption, because our own history taught us that monsters rarely announce themselves honestly. They hide behind treaties, they hide behind procedure, they hide behind the time it takes good people to agree that something terrible is actually happening. She stopped walking and faced Kalrash directly. Your fleet's own orders called for the pacification of an unarmed colony. That word, translated honestly, meant the killing of civilians who resisted losing their homes and their work to your resource agreement. That is not a war. That is not law enforcement. By any definition, your own species would apply to an enemy doing the same thing to you. That is the beginning of a massacre. The chamber was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, less confused, more uncertain, as counselors began quietly reconsidering everything they thought they understood about the battle. You still have not explained, Kalrash said, his voice quieter now, how 40 ships were destroyed so completely, so quickly, without a single human vessel present in that system. If no human gave the order, and no human fired the weapon, then what happened to our fleet? Voss returned to her seat and folded her hands again. That, she said, is the part I think you are not going to like. She reached out and touched the data drive still sitting on the table, and the screen above the council changed. It now showed a simple diagram, a human solar system, and around it, a scattering of small, quiet points of light spread through the space surrounding every settled human world, and every human colony beyond it. After the long silence ended, she said, humanity built something we call the Watch. It is not a fleet. It is not commanded by any government, any military, or any single person. It is a network of automated defense platforms, seeded quietly through every system where humans live or work, going back almost 200 years. Most of them have never activated. Most of them will never activate. They exist for exactly one purpose: to detect verified intent to commit mass killing against human civilians, and to respond immediately, without waiting for permission from anyone. The council stared at the screen, then back at her, disbelief plain on many of their faces. You are telling us, Kalrash said slowly, that an automatic system, with no human oversight in the moment, made the decision to destroy our fleet. I'm telling you the system did exactly what it was built to do, Voss said. It detected transmitted orders calling for the pacification of a human colony. It verified those orders through multiple independent means. And it responded. the way it has been quietly waiting to respond for 2 centuries, the moment the threshold was crossed. That is insane, one of the other counselors said, half rising from her seat. You built weapons capable of destroying an entire fleet, and you simply left them running, unsupervised, for 200 years? We built them once, during a time when we understood exactly how badly things could go if we waited too long to act, Voss said. And then, because they were doing exactly what we designed them to do, we let them keep doing it. Most humans alive today don't even think about the watch. It has become part of the background of our lives, the same way you might not think about the ground beneath your feet until the moment it matters. Kalrash sank back into his seat, his earlier confidence completely gone now. So there is no one to negotiate with, he said quietly. No commander to hold responsible. No government to demand reparations from. There is a government, Voss said, and it is willing to talk to you today, right now, about many things, but not about that fleet, not about an apology, and not about compensation for its loss, because as far as humanity is concerned, that fleet was not an army following orders. It was a weapon aimed at unarmed families, and it was stopped before it could do what it was sent to do. She let the silence stretch again before adding, "We don't bargain with murderers, counselor. Not even accidental ones. Not even ones who didn't know, themselves, exactly what orders they were carrying." The chamber remained silent. 12 species who had ruled the stars for far longer than humanity had even existed, slowly beginning to understand that the small, calm woman in front of them represented something far stranger and far more dangerous than anything their long history of careful diplomacy had ever prepared them to face. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. The weight of what Voss had said seemed to press down on the room itself, and even the ambient hum of the chamber's system seemed quieter than before. Finally, a new voice broke the silence. It came from a smaller figure seated near the edge of the circle, one of the junior counselors who had said nothing until now. Her name, according to the small marker at her seat, was Ithra Ven, and she represented one of the smaller Concord species, a people known more for careful record-keeping than for military strength. "Forgive me," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room, "but I find this difficult to accept without more proof. You claim an automated system destroyed our fleet without any living being making that choice in the moment. That is a convenient story, Envoy Voss. It removes all blame from your government while still allowing the destruction to serve your interests. How do we know this is not simply a well-prepared excuse, and that your military did not, in fact, coordinate a deliberate ambush?" Voss nodded slowly, as if she had expected exactly this question. "That's a fair thing to ask," she said. "So let me show you something else." She touched the data drive again, and the screen changed once more. This time it showed a wider map of the region of space near the destroyed fleet, sensor logs, communication records, and tracking data collected by neutral trade stations that operated in the area, stations that belonged to neither humanity nor the Concord. "These records are not ours," Voss said. "They come from independent trade posts that monitor traffic through that region for their own commercial reasons. You can verify them yourselves, through your own trusted sources, without relying on anything we provide. They show no human ships, no human transmissions, and no human presence anywhere near that system in the 72 hours before or after the battle. Whatever destroyed your fleet was already there, waiting, long before any of us in this room knew a battle was coming." Ithra studied the data carefully, her expression unreadable. Several other counselors leaned in as well, cross-checking pieces of the record against notes and devices of their own. "This is consistent with what we've observed," Ithra admitted slowly, "but it still does not explain why such a system exists. Why would any government build a weapon it cannot control, cannot recall, cannot even fully monitor in the moment? That is not strength, Envoy Voss. That is recklessness. I understand why you'd see it that way," Voss said, "but I'd ask you to think about it differently. What you call recklessness, we call commitment, a promise that cannot be broken because no one has the power to break it, even if they wanted to. Even if a future human government became weak or corrupt or afraid, it could not quietly agree to look away while another species prepared to slaughter human civilians. The decision was taken out of politics entirely, on purpose, because politics is exactly what allowed the long silence to happen in the first place." Kalrosh, who had remained quiet since his earlier humiliation, spoke again, though his voice was more careful now. You are saying that your species built a system it cannot turn off, specifically so that no future leader could ever be tempted to allow genocide against your people, even through inaction. Yes, Voss said simply. And this system has been active for 200 years. Yes. How many times has it activated before today? Voss paused before answering, and for the first time, something almost like sadness crossed her face. 17 times, she said. 6 of those were false alarms, caused by misunderstandings that were later resolved, and in each of those cases, the system correctly identified the situation as a false alarm before taking any lethal action. It verified intent, not just aggressive movement, before ever engaging. The other 11 were real. Real fleets, real raiders, real groups who had decided, for their own reasons, that human colonists were an acceptable target for slaughter. In every one of those 11 cases, the killing stopped within minutes of beginning, instead of continuing for days, weeks, or years. The chamber absorbed this in silence. Several counselors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly trying to process the idea of a defensive system that had operated, quietly and without oversight, across 2 centuries and multiple wars they had likely never even heard of. You never announced these events, Ithra said. Why? Because announcing them wasn't the point, Voss said. The watch isn't a warning system meant to frighten other species into good behavior. It's simply there, doing its job, whether anyone else in the galaxy knows about it or not. We don't need you to be afraid of it. We need it to work, quietly and reliably, exactly as it was built to do, for as long as it's needed. Kalrosh leaned forward, his composure returning slowly, though it was a different kind of composure now, less certain, more careful. And what precisely was needed here? A fleet was sent to enforce a resource agreement through admittedly harsh methods. Harsh, yes, perhaps even cruel by your standards. But you are calling it genocide, and treating it exactly the same as the 11 true attacks you just described. Do you truly believe the two are equal? Voss considered the question carefully before answering, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier coldness, replaced by something more thoughtful. The watch doesn't measure intent by scale, she said. It measures it by verified content. Your fleet's orders explicitly called for the killing of civilians who resisted. It doesn't matter whether that order came from ancient hatred or simple carelessness about resource negotiations. To the people who would have died, the reason behind the order wouldn't have mattered at all. Dead is dead, whether it comes from cruelty or convenience. She paused, then added, more quietly, I think that's the part most difficult for your council to accept. You didn't send that fleet because you hated us. You sent it because pacifying a small colony seemed like an acceptable cost of doing business. That kind of casual willingness to kill, when it's convenient rather than personal, is exactly what the long silence taught humanity to fear most. Not monsters who hate us. Ordinary leaders who simply decide, in a quiet meeting somewhere, that some deaths are an acceptable price for what they want. The chamber remained still, and for the first time since Voss had arrived, no one seemed eager to speak. The council had come into this meeting, expecting to judge a rogue and reckless species for an unprovoked act of violence. Instead, they were slowly beginning to understand that they were the ones being judged, by a system that had been quietly watching them the entire time, waiting to see if they would cross a line that, until today, they had not even known existed. It was Ithra Ven who finally broke the long silence, though her voice was quieter now, more thoughtful than confrontational. Envoy Voss, she said, even if everything you've told us is accurate, I still find myself troubled by one thing. This watch of yours acted with terrible speed and terrible precision. 40 ships, gone in minutes, with what appears to be perfect coordination between many separate defense platforms scattered through that system. That requires more than simple automated response. That requires something very close to actual judgment. How does a machine make a decision like that, correctly, every time, without ever making a mistake serious enough for your species to notice? Voss took a moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. It isn't perfect, she admitted. I told you there were false alarms, cases where the system correctly identified a misunderstanding before acting. That accuracy is not an accident. It came from decades of careful development, testing, and refinement. done specifically because we understood how catastrophic a mistake could be. A system that kills the wrong people because of a translation error or a misread signal would be exactly the kind of monster we built the watch to prevent in the first place. So we were careful, painfully careful, over a very long time, to make sure it only ever acted on verified, unmistakable evidence. And who verifies that evidence? If not a human being making a decision in the moment, Kalrash asked. The system requires multiple independent confirmations before acting, Voss said. Communication intercepts, sensor patterns, historical precedent, and in most cases, corroboration from more than one separate source. It is built to be slow to trigger and fast to act once triggered. Slow enough that innocent misunderstandings rarely reach the threshold, and fast enough that once genuine intent is confirmed, there is no time left for the killing to actually happen. A murmur passed through several counselors, some of whom seemed to be quietly recalculating everything they had assumed about humanity's capabilities. This changes things considerably, said another counselor, a broad, deep-voiced being named Drauskel, who had said little throughout the proceedings. We came here believing humanity had committed an act of unprovoked aggression against Concord forces. We intended, depending on your answers, to consider sanctions, perhaps even a coordinated response from multiple Concord fleets. If what you say is true, then the aggression was ours, however unintentional the framing of it may have been at the political level, and the response, however unsettling, was not aggression at all, but simple defense. I would be careful with the word simple, Voss said. There is nothing simple about killing, even when it is necessary. Humanity does not celebrate what the Watch does. We do not view those 17 activations as victories. Each one represents a moment when diplomacy, negotiation, and every peaceful option available had already failed or had never been tried at all by the other side. We would much rather this meeting had happened before your fleet ever left port, with someone from your government asking us honestly what pacification would actually require, instead of after, with 40 ships and their crews already gone. The chamber was quiet again, though the mood had shifted considerably from where it had started. The council had begun this meeting united in outrage, certain of humanity's guilt. Now, uncertainty and something close to shame had settled over many of the faces around the circle. Kalrash rose slowly from his seat, his earlier authority replaced by something more careful, more measured. Envoy Voss, I must ask you plainly, is there any possibility that this watch, this system you've described, could ever misidentify a legitimate military action as an act of genocide? Every species in this chamber conducts military operations from time to time, border disputes, enforcement actions, even, on rare occasions, punitive strikes against groups that violate agreements. If your system cannot tell the difference between disciplined military action and intentional slaughter, then no species in this galaxy is truly safe from it, human or otherwise. Voss considered this question longer than any before it. That's the right question to ask, she said finally. And the honest answer is that the Watch is not designed to react to military action in general. It reacts specifically to verified intent to kill civilians who are not combatants, who pose no military threat, and who have no ability to defend themselves. A border dispute between armed forces would never trigger it. A punitive strike against a colony that had, say, taken up arms against you would likely not trigger it either, however harsh it might be, because armed resistance changes the nature of the conflict entirely. What triggered it here was very specific: an order to pacify a population of unarmed civilians, workers and their families, who had done nothing more than refuse to leave land they had every right to remain on. And if we had simply left, and returned with a different kind of proposal, Ithra asked quietly, none of this would have happened at all. None of it, Voss confirmed. The Watch does not care about resource disputes, trade disagreements, or even harsh negotiating tactics. It cares about exactly one thing: whether human civilians are about to be killed for reasons that have nothing to do with their own actions. Everything else, however unpleasant, is a matter for diplomacy, not defense. The council sat with this for a long moment. Several of the alien leaders began speaking quietly among themselves, their voices low, clearly beginning to reconsider not just this single battle, but perhaps the broader policies that had led to it. Drauskel, in particular, seemed to be having an intense, quiet conversation with two counselors beside him, their expressions troubled. Finally, Kalrash spoke again, addressing the room rather than Voss directly. "It seems," he said slowly, "that we came here prepared to condemn a species for an act of murder, only to discover that the murder in question, however unintentional in its origin, was our own. The fleet we lost was not a victim. It was, by our own written orders, a weapon aimed at innocent people, stopped before it could complete its task." He turned back to Voss. "I do not say this easily, Envoy. It is not a comfortable thing for any government to admit. But I believe I speak for much of this council when I say we owe your people something very different from what we came here intending to demand." Voss inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the shift without any visible satisfaction or triumph. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "But before we talk about what comes next, I think it's important that everyone in this chamber understands exactly what humanity is, and is not, willing to offer in return." The council, still absorbing the full weight of what had been revealed, waited to hear what she would say next. Voss rose from her chair one final time, and the chamber, which had been filled with noise and argument only an hour before, fell completely silent to listen. "I want to be clear about several things," she said, "so that no one leaves this meeting with the wrong understanding of what humanity is offering and what it is not." She let her gaze move slowly around the circle of alien leaders before continuing. "First, there will be no reparations paid for the loss of your fleet. I know that may sound harsh, especially now that you understand the full situation. But reparations are something owed between parties who have wronged each other. Your fleet was not wronged, it was stopped, by a system built specifically to stop exactly what it was sent to do. We do not apologize for that, and we will not pay for it, regardless of how difficult that may be for some of your governments to accept." Several councillors shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke to challenge her. "Second," Voss continued, "there will be no formal apology from humanity, because we do not believe we did anything requiring one. I understand this may feel unsatisfying to some of you, especially those among you who did not know the true content of that fleet's orders, and who are, I think, genuinely troubled by what happened. I don't doubt that some of you are innocent of what your government intended, but the fleet carried orders written and approved somewhere within Concord Command, and those orders, not our response to them, are the true source of what happened in that system. We don't bargain with murderers, and we won't apologize for refusing to." The words landed heavily across the chamber, and for a long moment, no one moved. "But," Voss said, her tone shifting slightly, softening just enough to be noticeable, "that does not mean humanity has nothing to offer you today. Quite the opposite. I came here prepared to give you something far more valuable than an apology or a payment, something that I believe will matter far more to the safety of everyone in this room going forward." She reached into her small bag once more and placed a second data drive on the table. "This contains the general trigger conditions of the watch, translated carefully into terms every species in this Concord can understand clearly, along with rough coordinates of the defensive network surrounding every settled human system. Not exact locations, not technical specifications that could be used to disable or exploit it, but enough information that no government in this Concord will ever again find itself in the position yours did 3 days ago, sending a fleet toward a human colony without understanding exactly what conditions might trigger an automatic, unstoppable response." Kalrash stared at the small drive on the table as if it might be some kind of trick. "Why would you offer us this?" he asked slowly. "You have just told us, quite clearly, that you feel no responsibility for what happened. Why help us avoid the same outcome in the future?" "Because avoiding preventable deaths isn't a favor we're doing you," Voss said. "It's simply the sensible thing to do, for everyone involved, including us. Humanity gains nothing from more of your fleets being destroyed in the future. We gain nothing from more of our colonists dying in attacks the Watch has to stop. The best outcome, for every species in this chamber, is a galaxy where the Watch never has to activate again, because no one ever gives an order that would trigger it in the first place. Giving you this information makes that outcome more likely. That's the entire reason. Nothing more sentimental than that." Ithraven studied the data drive thoughtfully. "This is remarkably generous, for a species that claims not to be offering generosity at all," she said, something almost like a smile touching the edges of her voice. "Call it whatever helps you sleep at night," Voss said, and for the first time since arriving in the chamber, there was the faintest trace of warmth in her tone. "I call it common sense. You call it generosity. Either way, the information is the same, and the outcome we're both hoping for is the same too. Draus Kell spoke next, his deep voice carrying easily across the chamber. There is still the matter of what happens next between our peoples. The Concord came here today prepared for confrontation. Some among us, myself included, believed we were meeting with representatives of a species that had committed an unforgivable act of war. Instead, we find ourselves the ones who must answer for what was nearly done, and grateful, in a strange way, that it was stopped before it could be completed. Where do we go from here? Voss considered the question for a long moment before answering. That depends entirely on what the Concord decides to do with what it's learned today, she said. If your government chooses to review its policies towards smaller, weaker parties, human or otherwise, and ensures that orders like the one given to that fleet are never written again, then I believe our two peoples can move forward from here without further incident. If, however, this is simply forgotten once this meeting ends, treated as an unfortunate accident rather than a warning worth remembering, then I suspect we will all find ourselves back in a room very much like this one someday, discussing another fleet, another colony, and another silence that ended far too late. The chamber absorbed her words slowly, many of the counselors exchanging glances that suggested the weight of what she'd said had truly settled in. Kalrash rose one final time, his posture different now than it had been at the start of the meeting, less certain, more thoughtful, the posture of someone who had learned something he had not expected to learn. I believe I speak for this council, he said, when I say that today's meeting will not be quickly forgotten, Envoy Voss. We came expecting to judge a species we believed we understood. We leave instead, having learned that we understood almost nothing about you at all. Voss inclined her head slightly, gathering the small bag she had brought with her. That's probably the most useful thing to come out of today's meeting, she said. Understanding is usually where these things should have started in the first place, long before anyone gets close enough to needing something like the watch to step in. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at the circle of alien leaders one final time. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope we never have to meet like this again, not because I'm afraid of this council, or of what the Concord might do next, but because every time the watch activates, it means someone somewhere failed to have this conversation early enough. I'd much rather sit across from all of you discussing trade agreements and border treaties than explaining, after the fact, why an entire fleet had to disappear in 3 minutes of silence. With that, she walked out of the chamber, leaving behind a council that had entered the meeting united in anger, and now sat together in a very different kind of silence, one built not from outrage, but from the slow, uncomfortable understanding of exactly how close they had come to a mistake that could never be undone.